Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm picking some low-hanging fruit. Not because I'm being lazy, quite the contrary. I feel like this one is going to be research heavy for me in some spots, so it might actually have been easier for me to find a more practiced creationist to respond to. But what I'm going for here is kind of a case in point. We're used to seeing creationists like Answers in Genesis or the Institute for Creation Research or Creation Ministries International, big organizations with big budgets that usually have some highly qualified people on their side, making sure that the basic mistakes that creationists are prone to are well hidden to the casual observer. But this video is, in my opinion, an example of the results of such tactics. These organizations result in creationists who sincerely believe and think they know what they are talking about, but have ended up being completely mistaken on many very basic points. So let's go!
Hey, Pastor Steve Waldron here, New Life Pentecostal Church, Albany, Georgia. I hope you're having a great 2019 in Jesus.
I think, by contrast, most people's 2019s were great when compared to the dumpster fire that is 2020. But I am curious about the logistics of having a great year in Jesus. How is time inside Jesus? Is it only in Jesus if you're a Christian and not for non-Christians? Is that an evolution of the Latin Anno Domini, which translates to "in the year of the Lord," referring to how many years it's been since the birth of Jesus? And fun fact, I know there are apologists out there that make a big deal about how our whole calendar system is based on the birth of Christ. It's not, but the year counting is, at least in Western cultures. But with such an important date as the birth of God himself, we actually now know that we were off by at least 4 years. And even then, that's based on the death of King Herod, but the events surrounding Jesus' birth seem to be completely made up. The two accounts of his birth in the Bible don't even corroborate each other's stories. The only details they agree on are that his actual birth was in Bethlehem, and at some point after he was born, the family moved to Nazareth, after a few years in Matthew, and after a couple months in Luke. For a more detailed comparison, I did a read-through and comparison of the two Christmas stories a couple years ago. It's not my best work, but I do point out several inconsistencies between the two stories.
We're going to look at ways Darwinian evolution is obviously wrong.
There's actually an inverse correlation between how obvious it is that evolution is wrong and how much you understand about evolution. Because the more accurate your understanding, the more obvious it becomes that evolution is actually a great explanation for the diversity of life.
Now, we could go into it scientifically. I teach Science in the Bible 1 and 2 at Indiana Bible College.
That's right. This guy that I have picked out as low-hanging fruit that obviously has a very skewed understanding of evolution teaches a course on science at a Bible college. And while Indiana Bible College itself is not accredited, there are several accredited schools that will accept degrees from IBC from students pursuing accredited master's degrees or doctorates. Now, I have perused their websites and they don't appear to even pretend to offer scientific degrees outside of the social sciences, which on its own is very problematic and could be a video topic by itself, so at least they're not a diploma mill meant to give creationists scientific-sounding degrees. But still, if the students are learning about evolution from people that don't even grasp the basics, that's a huge problem.
Dozens of books out there, and they don't even know what evolution is anymore.
No, we know exactly what it is, but as time has gone on, science communicators have wised up to creationist shenanigans, and so have started phrasing different aspects of evolution in ways that make it more difficult for creationists to pull their usual tricks, like defining evolution as a change in allele frequencies in a population over successive generations. This is an observable fact that happens, and is so undeniable that creationists, when presented with this definition, will usually accept it but appeal to it being microevolution rather than macroevolution. But because the scientific side of the debate has changed its position on a number of occasions when presented with new information, the creationists like to spin that as scientists being uncertain and flitting from one explanation to another depending on what seems most convenient at the time. While the Bible is the firm rock that is reliable and doesn't change, when the reality is that scientists are simply willing to change their opinions and worldviews when presented with new information, while creationists remain stubborn in their opposition despite all the evidence to the contrary.
They know the basics, but some of the mechanisms, it's like, we just don't have a clue.
Some of the mechanisms, yeah, we don't have very good explanations for, but there are quite a few mechanisms that are very well understood.
Let's just look at some of the obviousness of the fallacies of Darwinian evolution. Look at yourself. The scripture says that you're fearfully and wonderfully made.
Yes, people in ancient times did not have a very good understanding of the complex machines that are our bodies. We now have a much better understanding of these machines than they did, but there is still a lot that we don't know. Now, much of what we do know has its basis in evolutionary biology, but still, the point he seems to be going for is that the ancient authors of the Bible were impressed by how complicated our bodies are, and therefore when we find out that they are indeed quite complicated, that is proof that evolution didn't happen.
And I may go into a little bit later in this little session on how Darwinian evolution is totally incompatible with Scripture.
Personally, I tend to agree with that, but if you want to keep Christians being Christian, it's a bad road to take because the evidence is so overwhelmingly in favor of evolution that when someone actually examines the real evidence for themselves and finds out which side has to rely almost entirely on quote mining and context removal, if they have learned that evolution and the Scriptures are incompatible, then they will cease to believe in the Scriptures given how well evidenced evolution is.
Doesn't matter what they taught you at college, it is just totally incompatible. But let's look at a shoulder joint, for example. Okay, so your shoulder fits into a joint. It is a socket. And then it's got tendons, it's got nerves, it's got capillaries, it's got blood vessels, it's got veins running through it. And it is a perfect machine.
It is far from perfect. Friction in the joint can lead to several painful problems. As someone who has recently had a brush with a partially torn ligament near the shoulder blade in my back, which translated into pain in the actual shoulder joint and down into my arm, I can tell you from personal experience that it's not a perfect joint. There's also tendinitis and tendon tears as a result of just using your shoulder normally throughout your life. That's a common chronic condition. Shoulder impingement, partial or total dislocation, each one making future dislocations more likely, and more. All of these are problems that result from it not being a perfect design.
Now let's just think about this. Let's say you're coming up from the gook, and all of this, and you're some type of protoplasm or...
Is that supposed to be an explanation of abiogenesis? Like, if you want to get into the evolutionary history of the skeletal structure, that can be fascinating, but you can't just look at one single joint and think that an animal existed that looked like a tetrapod but without the joint connecting its forelimbs to its body, until suddenly one day that joint appeared. You have to look at the development of the skeleton as a whole. It did not evolve in a vacuum where one trait was developed at a time to the exclusion of all the others, and the primordial organism that would have been the first thing that we might call alive would most certainly not have had any sort of bone structure at all. It wouldn't have even been multicellular, so there wouldn't be anywhere to put a shoulder joint.
Some intermediary life form, which they've never found any of these. They just don't exist in the fossil record. The fossil record should be overwhelming that, and it's none of that. There's a few, all the supposed ones would fit on this table in front of me.
That rant was all about transitional forms. Now, of course, he's thinking of big transitions like the move from water to land or the development of flight, but these major environment transitions are actually in the minority, and there are only a handful of major environments that would require these major transitions. The way I look at it, there are three: aquatic, terrestrial, and avian. Since life began in water, we would only expect to find transitions from water to land and from land to air, and since we have quite a number of not only fossil examples of these transitions, but living animals too, I'd say that those transitions are more than adequately represented. Hell, we even have transitions back from terrestrial into the water. Powered flight has evolved at least 4 times in birds, pterosaurs, insects, and bats. It possibly evolved 3 times in paravian dinosaurs, that is, the theropods that are closely related to birds but weren't actually birds. It was a large, diverse group of small, feathered theropods, several of which had gliding capabilities, so this group was absolutely ripe for the development of powered flight. These major transitions are well represented in the fossil record. And we have several species of fish that have evolved various methods for surviving, at least temporarily, on land. Walking catfish will leave their ponds in search of new ponds when they start to dry up. Mud skippers wallow in mud. Bashirs have been raised completely terrestrially, and the ones raised on land were significantly better at moving around on the land than their aquatic counterparts. Several fish whose natural habitat is in stagnant water have an organ called a labyrinth organ. It allows them to breathe in air in a similar fashion as a lung would. Several species of animal have developed gliding as a transportation mechanism, and gliding is a likely precursor to powered flight. Transitions are everywhere, and this is just from the 3 major environment categories that I've mentioned. If you want to get into transitioning between the environments within these categories, there are even more.
But the whole fossil record should be a chain of that.
It basically is. And given how rare the fossilization process is, it's actually quite remarkable that it is as complete as it is.
But they're all fully formed, fully filled. Come on, somebody's stealing your lunch money there.
What would a partially formed organism even look like in your mind? Even if you just want to focus on one characteristic, we have organisms with half everythings. Half an eye, flatworms. Half limbs, some of the fish I mentioned earlier. Half brains, creationists. Okay, that was mean. Let's go more with things like insects that have neurons and nervous systems, but their brains are incredibly simple, only 100,000 neurons compared to the 86 billion neurons that humans have. And these aren't even really halves. They are all spots on a gradient, where there are other organisms with these features more or less developed than the ones that I've chosen to use as examples.
All right, so how would this partial being, just, a shoulder joint, which we take for granted, what mechanisms is this a third of the way done, dangling, useless, because it only works if it's perfect?
Well, evolutionarily speaking, it was likely the wrists and forearms that came first. In fact, mutations in zebra danios have been observed to create bones that are analogous to what would have been proto-wrist bones. Zebra danios are ray-finned fish, but with a slight modification to one of their Hox genes, just one single genetic switch needs to be flipped, and they developed intermediate radials that are nearly identical to those found on lobe-finned fish, which are the side of the family tree that the tetrapods would have descended from. Relatively minor manipulations of the Hox genes have, on a number of occasions, demonstrated relatively major body plan adjustments. So I guess to answer your question, the mechanism that would turn it into something useful would be a modification of a Hox gene.
And so for generation after generation, it's flopping there. And so after millions of years, which they say hominids have only been around for 1.2 million years, so you can't even use the time plus nothing, thing there.
What are you even going for here? Do you think that each species had to independently evolve its shoulders? Shoulders have been around a lot longer than hominids have.
So over a few 100,000 years that somehow this bone being useless in this socket and these veins perfected themselves to where it works now.
Not really. As I mentioned earlier, this joint is far from perfect. And fun fact, it is found in similar forms in other animals as well. And you'll never guess what the distribution is. Turns out, the animals that we consider to be most closely related to humans tend to have shoulder joints that are more similar to humans, but this ball and socket type joint exists pretty much exclusively in species that exhibit the behavior of hanging by their arms. Humans are unique in that we have the joint to make hanging out possible, but we generally prefer not to use it that way. There's a reason monkey bars on the playground are called monkey bars and are pretty much exclusively found on playgrounds rather than being a part of our travel infrastructure like sidewalks. So it seems that our super flexible arm joint is a bit of a vestigial feature. Keep in mind though that vestigial does not mean useless. We have found all sorts of novel uses for it that would make our ape cousins jealous, like throwing balls really fast and accurately. It just means that it originally evolved for a different purpose than it is currently being used for.
See, that's sketchy.
Yes, your understanding of how evolution works is extremely sketchy.
It just didn't happen. It's impossible.
The way you described it, yes, it is impossible. But nobody thinks it happened that way except for creationists.
And that's the thing. I'm believing God for a great revival amongst evolutionists, because if they can have faith for the impossible, well, they can certainly believe in the historical person of Jesus Christ.
Well, nobody who understands evolution thinks it happens in the way that you just described, so no need for faith in the impossible. And I'd say that most people who do accept evolution don't have a problem believing that the character of Jesus was based on a real guy. The problem comes with believing the many impossible things that are attributed to him, not the least of which are the contradictory accounts of his birth that I've already touched on. So, did Jesus leave Bethlehem before he was 2 months old, as it says in the book of Luke, or after he was 2 years old, as it says in the book of Matthew? And did he stop in Egypt for a few years first, or just go straight on to Nazareth? If the story of his birth is so full of holes, why should I believe any of the miraculous stories that are attributed to him in these same books that are supposed to document his life? Will he use an example of evolution that isn't based on his ignorance of the theory? Will he realize that a joint that is prone to failure is not a perfect design? To find out, tune in tomorrow, same Rhino time, same Rhino channel.